It started with a sealed financial report quietly delivered through a side entrance at Buckingham Palace 1, marked with urgent clearance codes and reviewed behind locked doors. At first, aides dismissed it as routine housekeeping. But within hours, senior household staff were whispering about missing allocations, unexplained transfers, and a furious reaction from King Charles himself. By dawn, the palace machinery had already begun to move against Camilla's inner circle. And according to insiders, the king's decision was far harsher than anyone expected. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. At first, the atmosphere inside Buckingham Palace reportedly felt strangely restrained, almost unnaturally quiet, as if senior officials already understood the seriousness of what had been uncovered, but were terrified of speaking too soon. Reports suggest the sealed financial review had arrived late in the evening after weeks of internal scrutiny tied to household expenditures connected to Queen Camilla's private office. For months, minor concerns had allegedly circulated among Treasury-linked advisors and administrative staff, but those whispers were routinely dismissed as ordinary confusion surrounding the complicated machinery of royal finances. However, according to insiders familiar with palace operations, the newest audit was different. This time, investigators reportedly identified patterns that raised larger questions about oversight, accountability, and influence within one of the most protected inner circles in the monarchy. Those familiar with the situation claim King Charles was briefed personally late at night, long after most palace corridors had emptied. And what shocked many observers was not merely the content of the report, but the speed of the king's reaction once he absorbed its implications. Sources close to palace administrative streams suggest Charles became visibly angered by what he reportedly viewed as a dangerous threat to institutional credibility during one of the most fragile periods of his reign. Since early 2024, the monarchy has already operated beneath the shadow of uncertainty surrounding the king's health struggles, forcing senior royals to quietly assume larger responsibilities behind closed doors. But according to various interpretations of the text, his latest crisis, Charles allegedly feared something even more damaging than public embarrassment. He feared the erosion of trust inside the institution itself. Almost immediately, emergency financial reviews were reportedly initiated across select household departments connected to Camilla's office. Senior aides were allegedly instructed to freeze certain discretionary spending approvals while investigators examined records more closely. Palace insiders now whisper that the sudden restrictions stunned members of Camilla's advisory circle, many of whom had grown accustomed to operating with increasing confidence following the sun-drenched coronation of 2023. At the time, Camilla's influence inside royal structures appeared stronger than ever. Her household expanded. Her advisors gained visibility. Her authority seemed fully secured beside a king increasingly consumed by illness, constitutional burdens, and relentless public pressure. Yet, according to insiders, that confidence began collapsing the moment the audit findings reached Charles's desk. What reportedly disturbed palace officials most were not necessarily massive financial discrepancies, but irregular approval pathways and unexplained spending authorizations that appeared to bypass traditional oversight mechanisms. Those familiar with Buckingham Palace protocol claim this transformed the issue from a routine accounting concern into something far more politically explosive. Suddenly, conversations were no longer focused purely on money. They became focused on power. Who approved what? Who benefited? And more importantly, who inside the royal structure had become powerful enough to operate without scrutiny? It is now whispered in the highest echelons of palace administration that several senior figures began quietly questioning whether Camilla's private office had evolved into a parallel command structure operating beyond normal institutional safeguards. Meanwhile, media insiders reportedly noticed something deeply unusual unfolding behind the scenes. Normally, when pressure begins building around palace controversies, carefully crafted briefings quickly emerge to calm speculation and reassure royal correspondents. But this time, according to journalists familiar with royal operations, Camilla's camp remained almost completely silent. No strategic leaks, no soft denials, no friendly whispers to sympathy. Tick commentators. That silence only intensified speculation that the crisis inside Buckingham Palace had become far more serious than anyone initially understood. Some insiders even described the atmosphere as icy, with long-standing tensions between Camilla's advisors and Treasury-connected palace officials suddenly boiling to the surface all at once. And perhaps most damaging of all were the whispers now spreading through palace corridors that Charles himself had begun prioritizing the institution before the household. That phrase reportedly sent shockwaves through royal staff because within the House of Windsor, such language often signals the beginning of ruthless internal recalibrations. The monarchy survives by protecting itself first, even when that means humiliating those closest to the throne. According to observers, Charles increasingly appeared trapped between personal loyalty to his wife and the brutal constitutional instinct to preserve the crown's credibility at all costs. And as pressure mounted behind closed doors, many insiders quietly began asking the same terrifying question. If the king was willing to freeze parts of Camilla's household budget now, how far would he go if even deeper irregularities emerged? But the financial questions were only the surface of the crisis, because behind the numbers sat a far more dangerous accusation about influence, loyalty, and control inside the monarchy itself. For years, Queen Camilla's household operated like a carefully guarded fortress, inside the monarchy quiet, efficient, and fiercely loyal to her personal network. But according to palace observers, what once looked like harmless domestic authority had slowly evolved into something far more powerful. And as Charles's health struggles intensified behind the scenes, questions began surfacing about who was truly managing influence within the royal machine. At first, very few people inside royal circles openly questioned the growing reach of Camilla's household because the transformation happened slowly, almost invisibly, beneath the glittering surface of ceremonial appearances and carefully controlled public unity. Following the sun-drenched coronation of 2023, Camilla reportedly emerged with a level of institutional authority many insiders had not fully anticipated. Her advisors became increasingly present in key discussions. Trusted allies allege. DOI gained influence over staffing decisions, travel coordination, event planning, and internal approvals tied to royal engagements. According to various interpretations from palace commentators, it initially appeared to be nothing more than the natural evolution of a queen consort, settling into her historic role beside the king. But behind closed doors, a different interpretation was beginning to spread through Buckingham Palace corridors. Some insiders quietly feared that Camilla's household was no longer functioning merely as supportive infrastructure for the monarchy. It was becoming a competing center of influence within the institution itself. Those concerns reportedly intensified as King Charles's ongoing health struggles forced more operational responsibilities onto senior palace networks. Since early 2024, the monarchy has allegedly operated under extraordinary internal pressure, with Charles dividing his energy between constitutional obligations, medical treatments, and efforts to stabilize the crown during uncertain times. According to palace administrative whispers, that vacuum created opportunities for rival factions to quietly expand their reach, and few households reportedly adapted more effectively than Camilla's. Sources familiar with palace operations claim her private office became increasingly insulated from outside oversight, protected by a loyal circle of long-standing confidants who allegedly controlled access, approvals, and communications with remarkable precision. To supporters, it was efficient management during a difficult chapter in royal history. But to critics inside the institution, it began resembling something far more dangerous, a structure operating with growing independence from traditional palace safeguards. Questions soon started emerging about consulting arrangements, hospitality spending, travel expenditures, and the widening influence of individuals tied closely to Camilla's network. While no single allegation appeared catastrophic on its own, insiders claim the accumulation of concerns slowly unsettled members of what palace commentators often call the old guard. These were figures deeply loyal to the institutional traditions established during Queen Elizabeth II's reign, people who reportedly viewed unchecked personal influence as one of the greatest threats to the monarchy's long-term survival. According to those familiar with internal tensions, Prince William and Princess Anne gradually became increasingly uneasy about the optics surrounding Camilla's expanding authority. Not necessarily because of open hostility, but because the monarchy historically survives through rigid structures, carefully balanced power, and relentless oversight. And insiders whisper that some senior royals feared those balances were beginning to shift too far in one direction. What made the situation even more volatile was the growing perception that Charles himself was becoming trapped between emotional loyalty and institutional responsibility. Reports suggest the king trusted Camilla deeply on a personal level, especially after decades of public scrutiny and private sacrifice surrounding their relationship. Yet within the unforgiving world of royal survival, personal trust rarely shields anyone forever. According to observers familiar with previous palace crises, history has repeatedly shown that the monarchy becomes most ruthless when internal influence appears to exceed constitutional boundaries. Royal commentators quietly began comparing the atmosphere to earlier power struggles during past reigns, moments when competing households battled for proximity, authority, and control, while monarchs themselves struggled beneath the weight of the crown. Meanwhile, palace staff reportedly noticed subtle but undeniable fractures beginning to emerge behind the scenes. Long-standing courtiers allegedly grew more cautious during internal discussions. Treasury-linked advisors reportedly pushed harder for tighter accountability measures. And whispers surrounding Camilla's office became impossible to fully contain, especially as reports of financial irregularities slowly intensified. The institution that once appeared united now seemed increasingly divided beneath the polished exterior presented to the public. And for many insiders, the deeper fear was no longer about spending controversies or administrative disputes. It was about whether the monarchy itself was drifting toward a dangerous internal imbalance at the exact moment Charles was least capable of controlling it alone. And while the public still saw unity on palace balconies and ceremonial appearances, insiders claim an entirely different battle was unfolding behind closed doors. The documents reportedly arrived in stacks expense summaries, hospitality records, internal approvals, and disputed allocations stretching across months of royal activity. At first glance, nothing appeared explosive. But according to various interpretations from palace administrative circles, the deeper investigators looked, the more troubling the pattern became. And suddenly, what began as a routine audit transformed into a potential institutional embarrassment. By the time the financial files reached the most senior levels of Buckingham Palace administration, insiders claimed the atmosphere had already become tense, cautious, and deeply uneasy. What initially appeared to be ordinary household bookkeeping reportedly evolved into something far more complicated once auditors began comparing approval records, reimbursement pathways, and discretionary spending requests tied to Camilla's expanding household structure. According to sources familiar with the internal review, investigators allegedly identified repeated unusual discretionary expenses that, while not necessarily catastrophic on their own, formed a troubling pattern when examined collectively. The concern was no longer about isolated transactions. It was about the possibility that established financial safeguards inside the monarchy had slowly weakened beneath years of growing informal influence. Reports suggest several of the documents contained conflicting approval signatures tied to hospitality budgets, staffing reimbursements, and private entertaining costs associated with royal functions. Some palace accountants allegedly believed the discrepancies could be explained through administrative confusion during an especially chaotic period for the monarchy. But others reportedly warned that the inconsistencies revealed something much more dangerous: a breakdown in the traditional review structures that once governed royal expenditure with near-military precision. Those familiar with palace operations claim arguments quietly erupted between senior household officials over how seriously the findings should be treated. Some viewed the matter as manageable internal disorder. Others feared the institution was standing on the edge of a reputational disaster capable of damaging public trust at the worst possible moment. As investigators reportedly dug deeper, whispers began spreading that certain expenditures may have bypassed traditional review channels altogether. A core Ding to insiders, that possibility immediately escalated alarm throughout Treasury-linked palace circles because the monarchy survives largely on public confidence, discipline, and the perception of accountability. Once questions emerged suggesting approvals were granted outside established systems, the issue rapidly transforms from financial management into constitutional vulnerability. And during a period already overshadowed by concerns surrounding King Charles's health, palace advisors allegedly feared the timing could not have been more dangerous. The institution was already fragile. Public patience was already strained. Another controversy involving privilege, spending, or internal favoritism threatened to ignite a far larger crisis than anyone inside the palace was prepared to confront publicly. It is now whispered that Treasury-connected advisors privately warned senior royal officials about the potential reputational risks if even fragments of the audit findings became public. Some insiders allegedly described emergency discussions taking place behind closed doors, late into the evening as senior staff debated how aggressively the matter should be contained. Meanwhile, royal household accountants reportedly became increasingly divided over the severity of the findings themselves. According to various interpretations from those close to the process, one faction believed the irregularities reflected poor coordination during an unstable period of royal transition. Another faction feared the situation exposed a deeper culture of unchecked authority growing inside Camilla's private office. That divide reportedly intensified tensions throughout Buckingham Palace, especially as pressure mounted for Charles to personally intervene before speculation spiraled beyond control. And it was around this stage, insiders claim, that Prince Edward was quietly drawn into discussions surrounding the review process. Long regarded inside royal circles as one of the monarchy's most disciplined and procedurally cautious senior figures, Edward reportedly became a stabilizing presence during increasingly heated internal conversations. Sources familiar with palace dynamics suggest his reputation for administrative precision made him particularly valuable as advisors attempted to determine whether the irregularities reflected systemic failure or isolated mismanagement. Yet even Edward's involvement reportedly failed to calm growing fears among palace officials, because behind every spreadsheet, every disputed reimbursement, and every conflicting approval signature stood one terrifying reality. If the public ever concluded that royal finances were operating without proper oversight during a vulnerable reign, the damage to institutional credibility could become devastating. According to insiders, King Charles was eventually informed that public exposure of the audit controversy could significantly erode trust in the monarchy at a moment when stability mattered more than ever. And for those who know how deeply Charles values the preservation of the crown's legitimacy, that warning reportedly changed everything. Observers close to palace operations claimed the king no longer viewed the matter as a financial inconvenience. He began seeing it as a direct threat to the institution he had spent his entire life preparing to protect. The atmosphere reportedly shifted immediately afterward. Conversations became colder. Decisions became sharper. And many inside Buckingham Palace suddenly realized that what came next would not resemble quiet internal damage control. It would become something far more ruthless. But the real shock came not from the paperwork itself, it came from the speed and severity of Charles's response once he understood what palace officials feared could happen next. Those familiar with Buckingham Palace protocol described the moment as icy and immediate. There were no dramatic confrontations in public corridors. No raised voices, no official announcements. Instead, King Charles reportedly initiated what insiders now describe as a financial counteroffensive, one designed not only to contain the scandal, but to reassert control over the monarchy itself. According to palace insiders, the shift began almost overnight. Staff members who had spent years navigating familiar approval systems suddenly discovered that long-standing procedures had quietly changed without warning. Reports suggest Charles personally authorized reductions to portions of Camilla's household, discretionary budgets after receiving internal briefings about the growing audit concerns. While the palace publicly maintained its carefully polished image of unity and calm, insiders whisper that behind closed doors the atmosphere had become tense, calculated, and deeply uncomfortable. The king, long viewed as cautious and emotionally conflicted when dealing with family matters, was suddenly behaving with what some advisors allegedly described as cold institutional discipline. And for many within the royal structure, that change felt far more alarming than the financial controversy itself. Emergency oversight measures were reportedly implemented with extraordinary speed. Certain expenditure approvals allegedly bypassed Camilla's traditional household channels entirely and were redirected through senior royal finance officials connected directly to Buckingham Palace administration. According to those familiar with internal operations, the move stunned even experienced palace staff because such interventions are almost never enacted unless senior figures believe institutional credibility is genuinely under threat. Some insiders reportedly described the atmosphere as resembling a silent constitutional crackdown, one executed not through public humiliation, but through procedural isolation. Access tightened. Authorization slowed. Layers of scrutiny multiplied almost immediately. And while no formal accusations were publicly announced, the message inside the palace walls allegedly became unmistakably clear. The era of unchecked flexibility surrounding Camilla's household had abruptly come to an end. What made the situation even more explosive was the growing perception that Charles was no longer acting alone. Reports suggest both Prince William and Princess Anne quietly supported stronger institutional controls behind the scenes, believing the monarchy could not afford even the appearance of weakened financial discipline during such a fragile chapter in royal history. Anne, long respected as one of the monarchy's fiercest defenders of duty and structure, reportedly viewed tighter oversight as absolutely necessary to protect the crown from deeper reputational harm. William, meanwhile, allegedly became increasingly focused on safeguarding the future stability of the institution he would one day inherit. According to palace commentators, the alliance between Charles, Anne, and William signaled something larger than a routine internal review. It represented the old guard and the future heir aligning together in defense of the monarchy's survival instincts. Palace staff reportedly reacted with shock at how rapidly the restrictions were enforced. Those who once moved comfortably between Camilla's office and broader palace operations allegedly began encountering new barriers, delayed approvals, and intensified scrutiny surrounding financial requests. Some insiders even described the measures as a form of financial excommunication within royal structures, a phrase that quickly spread through administrative circles because of how brutally accurate it appeared to be. In the House of Windsor, influence is rarely removed publicly. It is slowly tightened, redirected, and contained until the balance of power quietly changes without formal acknowledgement. According to observers familiar with palace culture, Camilla's allies suddenly realized they were no longer operating from a position of unquestioned confidence. Their access was being reduced. Their authority was being challenged. And perhaps most dangerously of all, their political protection inside the institution no longer appeared guaranteed. Comparisons soon emerged to previous royal crackdowns tied to spending controversies and internal excess during earlier reigns. Royal commentators reportedly began recalling moments when the monarchy turned inward against its own WN members to preserve institutional legitimacy during periods of public distrust. However, insiders claim this crisis carried an even darker undertone because it unfolded during a time of visible uncertainty surrounding Charles's health and the future direction of the crown itself. Every financial decision now carried political meaning. Every restriction hinted at deeper anxieties surrounding succession, loyalty, and long-term authority inside Buckingham Palace. And according to those close to the unfolding tensions, Camilla's camp increasingly feared the budget cuts were merely the first stage of a much larger restructuring effort, already taking shape behind the scenes. As the restrictions expanded quietly across palace operations, the emotional distance between competing royal factions reportedly became impossible to ignore. Trust eroded, conversations hardened, and beneath the carefully choreographed appearances presented to the public, insiders claim a brutal internal recalibration had already begun. Because for Charles, this was no longer simply about disputed expenditures or administrative discipline. It had become about proving that the monarchy still answered to the crown. itself rather than any individual household surrounding it. And once that realization took hold inside Buckingham Palace, the conflict stopped being temporary. It became existential. Yet the budget cuts were only part of the strategy, because the deeper conflict was no longer just about money, but about succession, legacy, and who would shape the monarchy after Charles. As word of the restrictions spread through royal residences from Clarence House to Balmoral, the atmosphere reportedly turned cold, suspicious, and deeply fractured. Courtiers who once moved freely between households suddenly found themselves choosing sides. And according to multiple palace observers, the monarchy began slipping into the kind of internal power struggle it fears more than any public scandal. The shift inside royal circles was reportedly immediate and deeply unsettling. According to insiders familiar with palace dynamics, conversations that once flowed comfortably between competing households suddenly became guarded, strategic, and laced with distrust. Staff members who had spent years carefully balancing relationships across Buckingham Palace, Clarence House, Kensington Palace, and Balmoral allegedly found themselves trapped inside a silent political battlefield where every interaction carried consequences. What made the situation especially dangerous was the growing realization that this was no longer merely an audit controversy surrounding Camilla's household spending. The crisis had evolved into a struggle over influence, survival, and the future direction of the monarchy itself. And once palace factions began viewing the conflict through that lens, the emotional fractures reportedly deepened at extraordinary speed. Reports suggest Camilla's inner circle moved aggressively behind the scenes to defend her reputation as scrutiny intensified. Longtime allies allegedly argued that the financial concerns were being exaggerated by rivals, seeking to weaken her influence during one of the most vulnerable periods of Charles's reign. Some insiders whispered that members of Camilla's camp felt increasingly isolated as oversight measures tightened and palace attention shifted toward institutional preservation rather than personal loyalties. According to royal commentators, the Queen Consort's advisors reportedly feared that the restrictions imposed on her household were slowly reshaping public perceptions of her authority inside the monarchy. What had once appeared stable after the coronation was now beginning to look fragile, contested, and politically exposed. And in royal life, perception can become reality far faster than official statements ever can. At the same time, palace observers claim Prince William's camp quietly intensified its push for tighter modernization, stronger oversight, and greater transparency across royal operations. Those familiar with Kensington Palace strategy reportedly describe William as increasingly determined to protect the monarchy from future scandals that could damage public confidence in the institution he will eventually inherit. Behind closed doors, his allies allegedly viewed the crisis not as an isolated financial controversy, but as evidence that outdated structures and informal influence networks had grown too powerful inside royal administration. According to insiders, William's vision increasingly centered on discipline, accountability, and streamlined control designed to shield the crown from reputational collapse in an era of relentless scrutiny. And as those priorities gained traction, tensions with Camilla's house went up. LD reportedly became even more severe. Meanwhile, Princess Anne emerged in palace discussions as one of the strongest defenders of what insiders called duty over blood institutional discipline. Long respected for her uncompromising loyalty to royal responsibility, Anne allegedly viewed the growing conflict through a brutally practical lens. According to commentators close to palace culture, she understood better than almost anyone that monarchies rarely collapse from public criticism alone. They weaken when internal discipline erodes and competing factions place personal influence above the stability of the crown. Reports suggest Anne quietly supported Charles's restrictions and oversight measures because she believed the institution could not afford hesitation during a moment of visible vulnerability. To some insiders, her position appeared cold. To others, it represented the harsh survival instinct that has protected the monarchy for generations. As the internal divisions deepened, palace staff reportedly became increasingly anxious about the possibility of further audits, investigations, and administrative crackdowns. Morale allegedly deteriorated across several royal offices, as rumors spread that additional financial reviews could soon expand into other household operations. Some staff members reportedly feared becoming collateral damage in a widening institutional purge, while others scrambled to distance themselves from controversial decisions made months earlier. At the same time, media leaks intensified dramatically. According to royal correspondence, competing palace factions allegedly began maneuvering through carefully timed briefings, strategic whispers, and subtle attempts to shape the public narrative surrounding the crisis. Every leak seemed to reveal another layer of mistrust festering beneath the polished image of royal unity. And looming above all of it was the increasingly unavoidable question of succession and future power. Royal commentators openly began speculating about the long-term damage to Camilla's authority, while others questioned whether William's growing influence signaled the beginning of a much larger institutional transition already unfolding behind closed doors. Charles himself reportedly appeared exhausted, emotionally strained, and pressured from every direction as rival factions competed for influence around a monarch, already weakened by illness and mounting constitutional pressures. According to insiders, the king now faced a terrifying reality. The very institution he had spent decades preparing to lead was quietly dividing around him while he struggled to hold it together. And in the middle of the growing chaos stood Charles himself, a weakened monarch, forced to decide whether loyalty to family could survive the brutal demands of the crown. What shocked royal watchers most was not a public denial or an angry statement, it was silence. Days passed without visible resistance from Camilla's office. No carefully staged appearances. No reassuring briefings. And inside palace media circles, that silence quickly became interpreted as something far more revealing than words. For years, royal observers had grown accustomed to the careful rhythm of palace reputation management whenever controversy threatened to emerge. Friendly briefings would quietly circulate. Trusted correspondents would receive subtle reassurances. Narrative control would tighten almost immediately. But according to insiders familiar with Buckingham Palace operations, none of that happened this time. Instead, an eerie stillness sets. Led over Camilla's household as scrutiny surrounding the financial restrictions intensified. And within royal media circles, that silence reportedly sent shockwaves far greater than any public confrontation could have created. Because in the House of Windsor, silence is rarely accidental. It often signals calculation, containment, or fear. Reports suggest Camilla quietly withdrew from several internal planning discussions as tensions escalated behind closed doors. According to palace insiders, meetings that once routinely included her closest advisors allegedly proceeded without the same visible confidence or influence that had defined the months following the coronation. Observers familiar with royal structures began noticing subtle but important shifts in institutional behavior. Invitations reportedly changed. Administrative pathways tightened. Certain approvals slowed dramatically. And while none of these adjustments were publicly acknowledged, insiders claim the cumulative effect painted a deeply unsettling picture for those close to the Queen Consort's camp. The atmosphere surrounding Camilla no longer reflected expansion or authority. It reflected caution. Those familiar with the situation whisper that advisors around Camilla strongly urged her to avoid escalating the crisis publicly, fearing that any visible resistance against Charles's restrictions could trigger an even more damaging institutional backlash. According to various interpretations from palace commentators, the strategy became one of controlled retreat rather than confrontation. There would be no emotional public defense, no attempt to challenge the king openly, no visible signs of rebellion inside palace walls. Yet paradoxically, that restraint only intensified speculation among royal watchers who had expected a far more forceful response. Some insiders even began interpreting the silence as evidence that the situation inside Buckingham Palace was considerably worse than anyone outside the institution fully understood. Royal correspondents reportedly became particularly fascinated by the unusual absence of leaks defending Camilla's household. Under ordinary circumstances, palace factions often engage in quiet narrative warfare through strategic briefings aimed at shaping public perception without formal statements ever being issued. But according to media insiders, many journalists non-live found themselves receiving almost nothing from Camilla's traditional networks. The silence appeared disciplined, deliberate, and perhaps even imposed from above. As a result, the study found that the relationship between the two variables was not significant. Speculation rapidly grew that Charles himself may have personally demanded institutional calm, while financial oversight measures continued expanding behind the scenes. For a monarch already battling health concerns and growing constitutional pressure, the government is considering a constitutional amendment to address the issue. The last thing the palace needed was open warfare between competing royal households spilling into public view. What made the shift even more striking was the dramatic contrast between Camilla's earlier confidence after the coronation and her current restraint amid the unfolding crisis. Only months earlier, commentators had described her as increasingly secure within the monarchy's power structure, protected by decades of loyalty from Charles and strengthened by her expanding household influence. Yet now, according to palace observers, that confidence appeared visibly diminished beneath the weight of institutional resistance. Questions quietly spread through royal circles about whether Camilla had underestimated how aggressively the monarchy would protect its once concerns surrounding oversight and public trust began threatening the crown's stability. Because within the royal institution, personal closeness to the monarch does not always guarantee permanent protection when constitutional survival becomes the priority. At the same time, the broader public narrative reportedly began shifting away from sympathy for individual households and toward demands for restoring trust inside palace finances and governance structures. Royal commentators increasingly framed the controversy as part of a larger struggle over accountability, modernization, and the future direction of the monarchy itself. According to insiders, that shift deeply alarmed Camilla's allies because public perception was no longer centered solely on disputed expenditures. It was becoming connected to questions of legitimacy, influence, and institutional discipline. And once those themes dominate public discourse surrounding the crown, reputational recovery becomes extraordinarily difficult. Some commentators now openly speculate that the controversy may permanently weaken Camilla's long-term influence within royal structures, regardless of whether any formal wrongdoing since ever established. The damage, they argue, may already have been done through perception alone, because the monarchy survives through symbolism as much as governance, and symbols of restraint, discipline, and accountability now appeared to be aligning against her. Meanwhile, Charles reportedly remained trapped between emotional loyalty and institutional obligation, struggling to preserve stability while competing factions maneuvered carefully around him. And beneath the carefully controlled calm presented to the public, insiders claim an even larger transformation was already beginning to unfold inside Buckingham Palace. But behind the carefully controlled silence, another royal strategy was already taking shape, one that could redefine how power inside Buckingham Palace would operate for years to come. By the time senior royals gathered again under the chandeliers of Buckingham Palace, the atmosphere had reportedly changed forever. What once functioned as overlapping households now resembled competing command centers. And according to insiders familiar with the discussions, Prince William, Princess Anne, and Prince Edward had quietly aligned behind a single mission: protect the inside institution at any cost. According to palace observers, the transformation unfolding behind closed doors no longer resembled a temporary internal dispute. It had evolved into something colder, more disciplined, and far more permanent. Senior royal figures who once operated within separate spheres of influence were now reportedly coordinating with unusual precision as the monarchy attempted to stabilize itself after weeks of growing tension. Sources familiar with Buckingham Palace operations claim Prince William increasingly positioned himself at the center of discussions surrounding modernization, oversight, and institutional control. Not publicly, not dramatically, but through calculated involvement in operational decisions that signaled a clear shift in how the future monarchy intended to function. And for many insiders, that quiet emergence carried enormous significance because it suggested the crisis surrounding Camilla's household had accelerated changes that were already developing beneath the surface long before the audits began. Reports suggest William pushed strongly for tighter operational oversight across multiple royal households, arguing that informal influence structure could no longer operate without stronger accountability mechanisms. According to those familiar with Kensington Palace strategy, the Prince of Wales had become increasingly convinced that public trust in the monarchy now depended on visible discipline, modern governance, and carefully managed transparency. Palace commentators reportedly described his approach as less emotional than strategic. He was not focused on personalities, he was focused on survival. And within the House of Windsor, survival often requires brutal recalibration when old systems begin threatening institutional credibility. Insiders whisper that William understood something many others resisted acknowledging openly. Once confidence in royal administration begins eroding, the damage rarely stays contained to one household alone. It spreads across the entire crown. At the same time, Princess Anne reportedly emerged as the enforcer behind much of the tightening internal discipline now spreading through palace structures. Those close to royal operations allegedly described her approach as an iron protocol philosophy rooted entirely in accountability, restraint, and institutional duty. Anne, who spent decades earning respect through relentless public service and uncompromising loyalty to the monarchy, reportedly viewed the unfolding crisis through the harsh lens of constitutional survival rather than personal allegiance. According to insiders, she believed the monarchy's greatest strength had always been its ability to place the institution above individual discomfort, no matter how painful the consequences became behind closed doors. And as tensions deepened, Anne allegedly became increasingly influential in reinforcing the message that emotional loyalties could not override structural discipline during such a vulnerable chapter in royal history. Meanwhile, Prince Edward reportedly assumed a quieter but equally important role within the palace's evolving strategy. Sources familiar with internal restructuring efforts claim Edward worked discreetly alongside senior administrators to strengthen procedural oversight and streamline approval systems that had allegedly weakened during years of expanding household autonomy. Long viewed inside royal circles as methodical, dependable, and deeply cautious, Edward reportedly became an essential stabilizing figure as Buckingham Palace attempted to regain operational control without triggering wider institutional panic. According to observers, his involvement reflected the monarchy's growing reliance on senior royals considered disciplined, predictable, and constitutionally dependable at a moment when trust inside palace walls had become dangerously fragile. As Charles's health struggles continued placing enormous strain on the crown, insiders claim the king increasingly depended on trusted senior royals to help maintain stability behind the scenes. Palace aides were reportedly instructed to prioritize institutional reputation above personal loyalties, a phrase that quickly spread through royal circles because of what it implied. According to commentators familiar with royal culture, the language reflected an unmistakable shift toward the firm before the family, an old survival doctrine historically activated during periods of internal crisis. That doctrine, insiders whisper, often carries devastating emotional consequences because it forces the monarchy to treat personal relationships as secondary when institutional legitimacy appears threatened. And for Camilla's remaining allies, the implications reportedly became impossible to ignore. Observers claim members of Camilla's once confident network increasingly found themselves politically isolated as the palace consolidated around stricter oversight and centralized authority. Access reportedly narrowed, influence weakened, familiar alliances grew cautious, and across royal media circles, speculation intensified that the monarchy had quietly entered what some commentators described as a new order phase 1, defined less by overlapping personal households and more by tightly coordinated institutional governance centered around William's future reign. What began as an audit controversy had now evolved into something much larger, a reorganization of power itself. And according to those closest to the unfolding transition, the palace understood that once such transformations begin, they rarely reverse completely. And as the palace stabilized on the surface, the deeper message behind Charles's actions became impossible to ignore. In the end, the battle was never truly about accounting spreadsheets or household allowances. It was about something far older, colder, and more unforgiving: the survival instinct of the monarchy itself. Because when the institution senses vulnerability, history suggests it always turns inward first, sacrificing comfort, alliances, and sometimes even family to preserve the crown. By the time the crisis surrounding Camilla's household finally began settling into an uneasy silence, insiders claim Buckingham Palace had already changed in ways that could not easily be reversed. What started as whispered concerns over discretionary spending and internal approvals gradually evolved into a defining institutional reckoning, one that forced the monarchy to confront its own fears about influence, discipline, and survival during one of the most fragile periods of Charles's reign. According to palace commentators, the real significance of the scandal was never the financial figures themselves. It was what the controversy revealed about the monarchy's deepest instincts when confronted with instability from within. And those instincts, observers argue, are rarely sentimental. They are strategic, ruthless, and entirely focused on preserving the crown above everything else. Reports suggest King Charles ultimately came to view the situation through that unforgiving institutional lens. For years, many believed his personal loyalty to Camilla would shield her household from any serious internal challenge, especially after the long and controversial road they traveled together before finally reaching the throne. Yet, according to those familiar with palace operations, the king slowly realized that protecting the monarchy's credibility required painful decisions that could no longer be delayed. The reductions imposed on Camilla's household budget reportedly became symbolic of something much larger than financial discipline. They represented a clear declaration that no individual household, regardless of proximity to the monarch, could operate beyond institutional oversight once public trust appeared threatened. And for many inside royal circles, that realization marked one of the most significant shifts of Charles's reign so far. Royal commentators increasingly argue that the monarchy quietly entered a new era of internal control during the fallout from the controversy. The atmosphere inside Buckingham Palace reportedly became more centralized, more cautious, and far more focused on operational accountability than at any point since the transition following Queen Elizabeth II's death. According to insiders, Prince William emerged from the crisis with growing influence over the future direction of palace governance structures. What once appeared to be gradual preparation for kingship suddenly accelerated beneath the pressure of institutional uncertainty. William's emphasis on modernization, discipline, and strategic oversight reportedly gained powerful support among senior royal figures who feared the monarchy could not survive future scandals without tighter internal systems already in place. At the same time, Princess Anne's reputation inside palace walls reportedly became even stronger during the crisis. Long viewed as one of the monarchy's most reliable defenders of duty and constitutional order, Anne allegedly played a crucial role in reinforcing the harsh institutional mindset that guided the palace response. According to commentators familiar with royal culture, her influence grew not because she sought power personally, but because moments of instability tend to elevate figures who prioritize discipline over emotion. And in this particular conflict, discipline became everything. Palace officials reportedly concluded that future financial controversies had to be prevented at all costs, not simply for political optics, but because public confidence in the monarchy itself had become increasingly fragile in an age of relentless scrutiny and declining patience for perceived privilege. As a result, the study found that the relationship between the two variables was not significant. The scandal gradually transformed from a controversy surrounding Camilla's household into a broader warning about unchecked influence within royal structures. Insiders whisper that senior officials became deeply concerned about how easily overlapping loyalties, informal networks, and expanding household autonomy could weaken institutional safeguards if left unchallenged over time. What terrified many within Buckingham Palace was not merely the possibility of financial embarrassment, but the realization that competing centers of influence had quietly grown powerful enough to destabilize internal unity during a vulnerable reign. According to observers, that fear now shapes almost every major decision unfolding behind palace walls as the monarchy prepares for an uncertain future. And perhaps that is the deepest truth hidden beneath the scandal itself. The House of Windsor has survived wars, abdications, betrayals, public humiliation, and generations of internal conflict. It's not because it avoids crisis, but because it ultimately prioritizes survival over sentiment whenever pressure becomes unbearable. Charles, weakened by illness and surrounded by competing loyalties, reportedly faced the most painful reality any monarch can encounter. The crown demands sacrifice even from those closest to it, sometimes especially from those closest to it. And in the aftermath of the controversy, the monarchy appears more determined than ever to remind both insiders and the public that legacy, duty, and institutional endurance will always outweigh personal comfort inside the royal machine. Because within the House of Windsor, power is never truly owned, it is only borrowed, guarded, and, when necessary, taken back without warning. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.